Action. I'll now hand over to Sarah for our opening devotions.
Thanks, Richard. It's good to be together again this evening. Let's take a moment of quiet as we think about the things from today which have been exciting or encouraging, and those things which have brought us happiness. We think too about the things which have caused us anxiety or frustration or disappointment or hurt. We think about the seemingly mundane but necessary things from today which have taken our time, our energy, and our attention. And we ask God to help us to leave all of this to one side for a while and to focus instead on what God might be saying to us through this time together. Generous, loving God, creator of all, seen and unseen, we gather together from different experiences and different places, thanking you for this opportunity to think and hear more about all that you have made, and to think especially about our neighbours globally and also locally. You call us to love you with all our heart, soul, mind and strength, and to love our neighbours as ourselves. But we increasingly recognise we can't truly be good neighbours, we can't truly love one another when we do not take proper care of creation. We know the impacts of climate change are a matter of injustice, and we see that too often those worst affected are least able to deal with the impacts and have done least to cause these damaging impacts. Help us to use that knowledge to guide our choices and decisions and to shape our way of life as we seek to follow you more closely. Holy God, once more we pray that you would help us to gain fresh insight into what it means to love our neighbour by caring for creation. And we ask that you would help us to understand how we might better pray for and be better stewards of the world in which we live. Amen.
Thank you, Sarah. So I now want to introduce our speaker, Chris Walsh. He did a first degree in biology at the University of Manchester and escaped down to Bristol for a short while to do a master's in climate modelling and policy, but he's now seen the light and returned back to the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester. He's now working for his PhD. I think it's relevant for this talk to mention that he and his wife are part of an Eden urban mission team living in one of the poor areas of Salford, and I assume that's where he's speaking from tonight. And his current research relates to agriculture and bioenergy practices in response to climate change in Malawi, and that's what he's going to talk about this evening. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'll hand over to you, Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. So yes, so as I said, part of the Tyndall Centre of Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester, which I would really encourage anyone who's interested in this sort of thing in their local areas as well to look up, to do a lot of work on kind of local climate action and local climate change within councils. But getting to myself, I will just share my presentation with you. Hopefully you can all see that now. Richard, if you give me a nod quickly. Brilliant. So yes, so today I'm going to talk to you a bit about climate change and others, which is drawing largely on my work in Malawi, but also just going to present a little bit of what's actually happening to people now as a result of climate change. Because I think for me and for many, climate change can often feel like something that's sort of at arm's length, because it's not really affecting us yet in the UK in any significant way. Whereas the reality of climate change is that it is already really badly affecting people all around the world. So I hope you bear with me. these are the things I'm going to talk to you about today. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction as to what sustainable development is. I'm not going to spend a huge amount on that today, as a later talk in the series, Admos is far more qualified to talk about that than I am. But I'll give you a brief introduction to that as the background to my work. Then I'm going to talk about Malawi. I'm going to talk about what it's like as a country, give you some facts and figures about Malawi, and then I'm going to talk about climate change and what's already happening there. I don't know if anyone's seen the film, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, but if you had, you probably got a bit of a head start. And if you haven't, I'd really recommend you go and watch it. It's a really fantastic film that does a really good job of demonstrating some of the impacts that climate change has had in that country already. Then I'm going to talk a bit more about my research in terms of bioenergy. I'll explain what I mean by bioenergy, and then I'm going to tell a couple of stories that I found out while I was in Malawi. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some reflections that I had about prayer and about how this project in particular has really changed my faith and my prayer life. Okay, so sustainable development. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a set of 17 goals that's set forth by the UNDP. Sorry if this is a little small, but they're effectively an aspirational group of targets that if we were to be able to do them, we would feel like we had a better world or a sustainable world that we could keep going. So for me, SDG 7 is the most important one. Which is all about affordable and clean energy providing. Within each goal, it roughly splits into 3 targets. So within energy, that's about access to clean energy, which means energy that isn't polluting and energy that isn't harmful to your health. So one of the things with these SDGs that we come across quite a lot is that they all interact with each other. So SDG 1 you saw was no poverty. SDG 7 is energy. If people have access to energy, they often have access to lighting so that they can do schoolwork later at night, or they have access to energy to provide from mobile phones. They're able to engage in business. So there's a lot of synergies and a lot of kind of coexisting between sustainable development goals. And that's one of the things I'm looking at trying to maximize. So here is a bit of work that somebody did, which gives all the synergies within SDG 7, which is 92% of them all work together with SDG 7. So some examples of this might be SDG 3, which is about health, cook stoves in Kenya, preventing harmful fumes, or SDG 6, which was random biogas, which is the use of wastewater in prisons. So it's their efforts to make investment kind of double within itself. But the downside of that is there are also major trade-offs. So in terms of investing in energy, it might mean that you have to, you suffer in other ways. So for instance, in South Africa, sugar is grown as a cash crop. But if you were, one of the possible uses of it is for energy. If you're using it for energy, you can't necessarily use that for food. It's that sort of trade-off that we're trying to manage. And my work is looking into the governance methods that can help those to be managed to a level where we're more successful at doing it. So Malawi, this is the country that my fieldwork has been based in. So 2 years ago, just before COVID, I managed to get in about 4.5 months living there, doing fieldwork there, talking with people all about different energy projects and different uses of bioenergy in the country. Just in case you didn't know, Malawi is a relatively small landlocked nation in the southeast of Africa, with a population of approximately 18 million. Although by 2050, that's forecasted to be a population of 45 million. It is mostly rural. It's about 85% rural. However, that number is declining at a rate of about 0.5% every year, which is about an annual movement of about 100,000 people from rural locations to the cities. Within the urban populations, there's two major cities in Malawi. You can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the capital city, Lilongwe, which is right in the center. And then there's a southern city called Blantyre, which is the kind of financial hub of Malawi, both of which have a population of roughly 1 million. And the other interesting thing about Malawi is its lake, which roughly is about 25% of the total surface area of the country, and represents a key resource in terms of energy, partly through hydropower, which is the only real form of energy generation they have on any significant scale in Malawi, but also in terms of massive oil deposits that have recently been found under there, which might become an evolving story as time goes on. Malawi is a very, very poor country. This graph, and I promise there won't be too many graphs, but this graph just shows the percentage of the population that is classified as living in poverty, which in Malawi is about 69%. Malawi's life expectancy is incredibly low. Its life expectancy is now about 55. With the main cause of death still being HIV and AIDS, and it's a country that has been majorly impacted by that. The country, as you can see, in terms of poverty on the left-hand side, it's largely based in the south, which is the far more developed area of the country. It's also the area of the country that is hottest. The top of the north above Lilongwe is in the Rift Valley sort of area. So actually it's far more of a temperate sort of subtropical climate. You see forests and it's not that warm, it's quite cool. Whereas in the south is kind of more what you think of when you think of the Disney version of Africa. Much more kind of plains, very limited tree cover now. And it's a significantly low altitude, so it's much hotter and drier. Despite that, that is where the majority of the population of Malawi do live, which cause some troubles that I will come on to. This is just a quick breakdown of age, just to illustrate how much of a young country Malawi is, largely because of the AIDS epidemic, which obviously removed a fair amount of the older people in the country. So this is the first kind of talk about climate change in Malawi. This is just a demonstration by USAID, which they've been doing over the past 30 years as to land cover in Malawi. So where you see green, that relates to some sort of forest, and where you see purple or the bright pink, that is now cropland. So as you can see, Malawi has been on a trajectory that is moving from a very densely forested place to a much drier, much more open land, particularly in the south. A large cause of this is that most of the people in Malawi are engaged in subsistence level agriculture, approximately 90%. So that's living off the food that they are able to grow themselves. If you have seen The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, you'll know that tree cover is essential for a great many things in agriculture, namely stopping high winds, stopping surface erosion, prevention against floods. And indeed, just before I went to Malawi, I don't know if anyone remembers Cyclone Idai a couple of years ago, which affected Mozambique and Malawi, which was a huge storm that left, I think it was 30% of Malawians homeless. It was a really remarkably big storm. And a lot of Malawi's issues within that come from the fact they are increasingly having these droughts or storm events. this is some modeling that was done about what it's going to look like in Malawi in the future. And this is with 1.5 degree warming, which in climate sort of lingo is not very much. This is kind of the minimum that we can expect to happen in Malawi. So as you can see, on the left-hand side, you've got precipitation. Precipitation is going to become much more narrowed. So the light coloured band is the 1.5 degree warming, and the black is the unconstrained emissions. So if we do manage to keep to the 1.5, which is, as I say, very, very unlikely, Malawi will average out with enough rainwater roughly to sustain agriculture there. However, with an unconstrained emission scenario, we are looking at a lot longer wet season, which has significant impacts in terms of sowing and harvesting, but also a lot less rain over that longer season. In terms of temperature, we're looking at approximately an extra 2 degrees on top of 2 degrees more warming in Malawi, which is already at the top end of the heat in terms of food insecurity. What does this mean in real terms? This means that by 2050, 2/3 of Malawians are going to be much worse off in terms of agricultural production. If I just remind you, 90% of the population of Malawi directly relies on subsistence farming, so directly relies on this. So 66% much worse, 50% worse. It's in a real serious situation. In Malawi, currently, it's estimated that 1.8 million children are at high risk of malnutrition. This is estimated in 2050 to be approximately 5 million. So yes, so not the most upbeat, I'm sorry, but a real reminder of what's already happening, because as you can see from that graph, that's already happening with deforestation. These people are already really struggling in terms of crop yields and in terms of their ability to be able to live on what they're generating. So where does bioenergy come into this? So bioenergy is one of the kind of renewable energy technologies. So you may have heard of wind and solar. Bioenergy is effectively using bio waste, so anything in terms of, it could be plant matter, it could be manure, all that kind of thing, to create a more sustainable way of living. So some examples from Malawi are these are chiteze and baulas. They are clay pots which are designed to create a more efficient burning of wood. In Malawi, 97% of people cook with either charcoal or wood or another kind of plant matter. So actually there's a real need for some kind of solution that meets that. And one possible way of doing this is through better equipment. Commonly, people cook on 3 bricks in Malawi in a triangle, which you rest a pot on, so it's an open fire. And you can imagine not particularly efficient, emitting an awful lot of pollutants, a lot of smoke, which is very poor for your health and also poor for the environment. As I said earlier, Malawi is very poor, so solutions-wise, we can't often rely on technologies that will not support themselves economically, or technologies that are expensive. So this is one very cheap possible way to increase people's standards of living and access to energy very, very quickly. Second kind of example of bioenergy that I was looking at was in terms of biogas, which is kind of the process called anaerobic digestion. You may be familiar with in the UK. It's kind of composting on steroids, really. It's using manure and agricultural waste, as well as industrial waste, waste from markets in terms of food. And you effectively digest those together, creating methane and digestate, which is kind of the leftover bit. Digestate, once processed, can then be used as fertilizer and put it back into the ground to create more agricultural waste, which then can be put back in. The gas can be taken off and can be used on a wide level for heat generation or power generation, or on a local level for cooking or heating. This is one of the projects that I was visiting in Malawi, and as you can see, it's effectively a tank in someone's back garden. It's a big bag that you fill with the digestate, and then you are able to siphon the gas off top, which will run at the kind of burner that you use in sort of a camping stove sort of situation. And increasingly in the urban areas of Malawi, this is becoming a viable solution for a growing middle class that's emerging that is still using charcoal currently. But this might present one possible usage. So why bioenergy? As I've said, the predominant energy need in Malawi is about household. Bioenergy is easy to do on a household level, partly because of the massive abundance of resources in Malawi currently, as in with lots of countries. When crops are left in the field, they're burnt off at the end of the season, a practice which doesn't really help the ground because it's over too short a span, and a process which obviously pollutes excess. So instead, we can use that waste in a productive way, that waste that's also currently free. Bioenergy is great because you can use it on different scales. As I said, you've got the kind of proper power production. So in Rwanda, for instance, in prison systems, and I'm sorry for this slightly disgusting thing, but human waste is used in biogas production plants to produce heat and cooking sources for municipal buildings like prisons, which saves a significant amount of money for a government that doesn't have a great deal of its own cash to spend. It has a really wide-ranging utility. Bioenergy kind of can exist from that Brazilian sort of ethanol production, which goes in petrol, or it can go all the way to the biogas that I've already talked about. And as I say, it's relatively cheap in a country where you cannot really afford to invest in equipment. While I was talking with a lot of the communities that I was in, and I went to roughly 30 villages in Malawi, I think, I would always ask how much disposable income, or how much would you be willing to put in to get this technology? And the answer never came back above our equivalent of £2. I think one way to demonstrate this is in terms of the currency that's available, in terms of the notes and coins in Malawi, the maximum note you can get is 2,000 kwacha, which is equivalent to £2. And that goes down all the way down to 1 kwacha coins, which still exist and still used in villages. That might give you some idea. So 1 kwacha is 1/10 of a penny. So any sort of technology that can come in either needs to pay for itself and its own upkeep, or it needs to be incredibly cheap. So in Malawi, there's kind of a complex picture of what's already going on with bioenergy. In a lot of countries in the 1980s, bioenergy was embraced by governments as a way to provide petrol and as a way to provide cheap energy on a very, very large scale. And so in Malawi, as in lots of South African countries, they have major sugarcane facilities that produce bioethanol, which is then used to generate power and for cooking gas, which are owned either by the government or by a private company. I was able to go to the government one. The private company were less keen to have researchers looking around, but it was quite an interesting place to be, and a kind of scale that you don't really see. Second part of bioenergy is about foreign investment and charities. So this would be through the UK, through DFID. We sponsor a lot of Mbowler, which is that stove. It's called a Chiteza Mbowler. We sponsor small investments, setting up little cottage industries in villages, creating those, and then distributing them and selling them as a source of income. The GIZ, which is the German version, is also very heavily involved. And there's also charity development, which is going on there, where charities like Tier Fund will go in and help communities through crop management techniques, giving them new agricultural techniques. I've also seen them doing some biogas stuff, which has been really interesting, and helping some small businesses to get seed funding for that. The third area of bioenergy is around their government regulation. So as I said, charcoal is very, very big in Malawi, particularly in urban areas, because of its long burn and its really high temperature it can get to. However, charcoal has become a real issue because of deforestation. If you drive down roads in rural Africa, and in fact, I had a photo of a man on a bike with a huge sack of charcoal on the back of his bike. It's a very, very common sight, even though it's completely illegal. And on regional levels, we're seeing more and more investment looking at bids for small pots of money to integrate small projects. The final thing that's happening with bioenergy in Malawi is through the UN. The UN is starting to try and offer small funds of money to different companies. One of the major issues in Malawi is access to funds if you're trying to start a business. Bank loans, currently the interest rate is 42%, which is far too high to be able to start any sort of business on, especially a business that relies on creating some sort of agricultural project. So that's kind of what's going on in Malawi at the minute. So I wanted to just finish with 2 stories for you of different things that are going on in Malawi at the minute. This photo just shows you what I was doing while I was there. I was talking to people, getting them to tell me what sort of information they receive from people, where they get their information from. I was looking particularly at how the government and how international bodies interacted with people and the ways in which that can be improved. And so more than one half of my research was based in the villages, and particularly villages that had already experienced some sort of aid or some sort of project there. So this village, for example, a Judtrofa project, which I'll explain more about in my second story. And the other little part of my project was with workers in the charcoal industry, which is the first thing I'm going to talk about. So Malawi's deforestation problem, as I said, is horrific. And one of the main drivers of this is charcoal. Charcoal, as I say, burns extremely well and extremely long. However, it is prohibitively expensive in terms of resources to make. If you imagine what you're doing when you're creating charcoal, you're effectively burning wood down to get a smaller, more compressed product. And so you end up using an awful lot of wood to create not very much charcoal. However, charcoal is extremely valuable. And if you are a subsistence farmer who has no real access to money and funds, it's a very quick way to generate a lot of money very, very quickly. One of those big bags of charcoal would go for approximately 5,000 kwacha, which is £5 in the end. So that farmer would sell that to a transporter or to a kind of illegal company for approximately 2,000 kwacha, who would take it into the cities and then sell it on. Charcoal is hugely available. You can buy it almost anywhere you go. You see these on the side of the roads. There is almost no enforcement. There are routine gates. So you go through checkpoints on every major road in Malawi, which are always manned. However, they always have approximately 100 meters before the checkpoint, a track going off to the left. and then approximately 100 meters after the checkpoint, a track coming back on where people go round. There was a brief period in Malawian history where it was heavily enforced. In fact, the army was stationed in forests throughout the country, and charcoal production went down by estimated to be about 80%, which is a huge amount and a huge success. However, after 2 years, charcoal production returned, and it turned out that the army had stopped being paid by the Department of Forestry, and so had started selling the charcoal themselves to make up the wages for them. So it's this hugely complex issue. It's this integral part of a lot of people's cooking, and as we all know, cooking is such a central part of our daily lives. So there's this massive issue. So I went to talk to the riders mostly who transported charcoal. Now, because riders are illegal and can still be thrown in jail, they live in a hugely precarious position and are not engaged by anybody who isn't either buying the charcoal or going to arrest them. So I did some work talking with these people, talking with investment and charity organisations about them. And I found there was almost no investment in working with the transporters themselves to form different income streams or different ways that they could make money. And also there was almost no protection of these people as well. So they were routinely risking their lives for a very quick buck, which is a very sad position to be in, particularly as now in the south part of Malawi, they have run out of usable forest. So they are unfortunately having to go over the border into Mozambique, which is a much more dangerous terrain in terms of wild animals and in terms of legacy of a very recent civil war. So that's one area that I was exploring. And the second area, so I was going to remind you quickly of how bad it's got in the south of Malawi. It is quite mind-blowing when you're driving through the country. You see the north and it's forests as far as you can see, right next to the road, driving through absolutely beautiful scenery. Almost looks like South America. You know, you see those pictures of Machu Picchu surrounded by trees on the hills, like that sort of thing. It almost looks that way. But then you go to the south and there's just nothing. It's just dust, roads in the middle of big plains with subsistence pasture all around you. It's quite shocking. Yes. So the second thing I want to tell you about, and hopefully a little bit more upbeat than the charcoal situation, is about Burl, which is a private company that's been set up there, who use a plant called jatropha as a biodiesel generator. Earlier on, I showed a quick picture of a fruit on a tree. That's the fruit on a jatropha bush, which once it's processed, you can get biodiesel out, which can then be used effectively in the same way as kerosene is. Burl was set up in about 2010 as a project and ran roughly until 2015, although the ending is a little bit spotty. And I had read a fair bit about Burl before I even arrived in the country, and this is kind of what I'd drawn from it. It was this huge nationwide investment, but actually it fell apart because of a lack of markets and poor communication, and also a reliance on very male-led schemes, when in fact agriculture in Malawi is predominantly a female industry. So I arrived at villages like this to talk through the legacy of Burl. I wanted to discover how that had impacted people and what their opinions now were on using it in the future. I also went and talked to a load of the management of Burl, and to both senior levels and also middle kind of levels who were distributing distributing the seeds and managing it on a regional basis. And this is kind of what I found. So on the ground, really well-maintained crops, people were still maintaining the crops as intended by Burl. As I mentioned earlier, I mentioned that there was a trade-off between space given up for crop space for food and space given up for energy usage. But actually what Burl had done is they'd only used the outskirts. They'd effectively fenced in fields with the jatropha plants, which was a really clever solution. And so actually nobody's crops had been affected. I found whole rooms of seeds. This is quite incredible. People were still keeping these seeds, not knowing when they were going to be used, and hopefully they will be, but people had whole barns full of seeds ready to go. I found people were incredibly motivated. It was something that it was a project that had really installed values in the right way. It had included people in the whole process. In each village, they'd included a man and a woman to be the go-betweens who they'd paid, and they were continuing to pay. There's this huge sense of optimism and of future plans, and indeed that went right to the top, as they're currently in the process of relaunching Burl, which could be a really excellent thing to re-engage with an industry that has a huge amount of potential. I should also say that there were some issues in terms of some farmers had gone all in with these plants and unfortunately ripped up their whole crop, which was a really sad thing to see. But in the areas where I found that there was most kind of leadership on the ground, you could see that the method was done right. It was carried out right, which was a really good thing to see. So yes, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into what's happening in Malawi right now. It's a kind of period of optimism outside of COVID stuff. In Malawi, they've just got a new government for the first time in, I want to say, it's since they ended their dictatorship, so 30 years. They've been kind of a one-party state, maintained, we call it a very competitive electoral system, which means it's often contested, but not necessarily fairly contested. So there was a large court trial after the last election and results were thrown out and redone, and the opposition has come into power. So there's a real feeling among people that I know who are there of this real optimism and this real embrace of new ideas. And that's been echoed in particular with the German aid companies who are working really hard on engaging new people in this area. And it's been a real positive since my work ended, in fact, to just be able to see the growth in the companies and some of the places that I went. So yes, so that's a bit of my work. I'd love to hear any questions. I'll do my best to answer them. Yes, thank you for listening.
Can't say anything if I don't unmute myself. So thanks very much, Chris. Unfortunately, we can't give you a round of applause because you won't be able to hear it and we're all muted, but I'm sure on behalf of everybody, I can express our appreciation to you. We're not getting any questions through yet on chat. So if anybody's got, there we go. We've got one coming through, but please, if you have got things to ask of Chris, please fire away. So we'll start off with the one that Kevin has posed. If Burl relaunches, will the fuel be used in Malawi or sold for export? If it's for export, doesn't that leave Malawi worst off with land lost for food production and still no fuel to cook with? So one of these complex economic issues. I'm sure you've got perspective, Chris.
Yeah, the reality is it probably wouldn't be used for export. So there's a kind of complex situation going on around export and import in Malawi in terms of tariffs. They're super, super high because their government is kind of very protectionist. So I don't know that it would be exported. I think the biggest danger in terms of exporting energy would be if some country in maybe South Africa, who have done it before in Mozambique, were to obtain a license to drill the oil in Lake Malawi. That would be quite a large issue. Pearl is very Malawian focused. It's run by a couple of guys who've been brought up and lived in Malawi. So hopefully that wouldn't happen, but I do share your kind of concerns with that.
A really interesting question, I think, from Emma Gardner. Are there any lessons that we in the UK can learn from how they're handling things in Malawi? I think we often think that development is a one-way process. We give the information to other countries, but are there things we can learn from them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a kind of development way, absolutely. In terms of when we go and invest in countries, there is kind of, I think a lot of people still act in quite a colonial sort of way and just kind of rump in, we know what's best for the land. But actually, there's such a depth of knowledge about really kind of fundamental, really fundamental agricultural practice in terms of, some of you might be familiar with conservation agriculture and different techniques like no-till, when in fact in lots of villages, these kind of what we would refer to as kind of newer agricultural techniques have been going on for a really long time. So yes, I do absolutely think that the best projects are learning from people who live in the area.
Okay. I'm flipping through some of the questions. Tony asks one about burning biofuel, which obviously releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. What's the balance between, using charcoal as a reasonably efficient fuel and actually allowing the trees to continue to grow?
I think the reality with charcoal is it's not created in a sustainable way. There is a push now in Malawi for sustainable sourced charcoal, but the reality of charcoal as it is now is that it's not from sustainable sources. It's the equivalent of us going into ancient woodland and chopping it all down and making charcoal. It's not from a managed forest system. I think that's the real difference. Because absolutely, a managed system is, I think, a great way to certainly bring down the footprint of charcoal, which would be a success in itself.
And a couple of people are asking almost the obvious question. There seems to be so much sunshine there. Is what is the future for solar power alongside these other projects?
So Malawi hopefully has a really good future on solar power. There's just a few really, really massive barriers to it. The first being the fact that Malawi is landlocked. And so actually getting the technology to the country is incredibly expensive. You would probably have to come from the east. So it would have to come from China. And there are some concerns about Chinese-based solar is perhaps not as well made, although that's getting better. The other question is how to make it sustainable in a community. And hopefully, so one of my colleagues is doing a project at the minute on little microgrids and using those in Malawi, and there's been plenty of work done on them in Kenya. And in fact, Ethiopia is kind of the leader in it. But there is a way to do it. It just needs a certain level of investment that, to be honest, Malawi is probably too poor to manage.
Yeah, and presumably there just isn't the money in local communities, even with microcredit schemes or things like that, to invest in that sort of technology.
Absolutely. There's very little microcredit schemes already there as well.
Perhaps a final question before we move on is the change in our government's levels of funding of overseas aid likely to have an impact on any of this? Does much of that money go to Malawi at the moment?
Yeah, yes. I don't want to be too political, but I think it's an absolute disgrace. Yeah, I don't think there's much more to say, really.
Okay, so this is one of the examples of what is going to be hit by the changes that they're going through at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so that's been some really interesting questions and some really interesting answers, Chris. Can I ask you therefore to just continue with the second half of your talk about prayer?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I wanted to reflect just a bit on my kind of faith and and how that was for me in Malawi. So I thought I'd start with this photo, and this is a photo in Livingstonia. So one of the things you might know about Malawi is it's where Dr. Livingstone died from malaria. And this is the church in the place that he died, and I'm right standing on top of. Sorry, this is a kind of self-indulgent, but this is the church stained glass window, which is Livingstone in Malawi, which is pretty cool. This is like one of the major attractions in Malawi. There's not much tourist build-up, but this is quite something, this church. Anyway, so reflecting on my faith in Malawi, I think the first big reflection that I think I took, and that I think we should all take, is a real stance of repentance. The reality is that we live in a society and a place where we are responsible, historically and now, for most of these emissions. I appreciate some people might say things like, I don't know, China's worse, but there is a reality that our lives as we live them now are directly impacting people, and how we've lived them has directly impacted people. I was just thinking of as I was kind of praying and thinking about what I wanted to say with this, I was just coming up with some Bible verses about this, and I think for this first one I got a real sense of kind of stewardship in Genesis 1, where God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals." And I think the reality is we haven't ruled well, and that we are called as Christians to repent for that, which is an uncomfortable thing to do. But I think actually acknowledgement of that and our sin in that is the first part of changing ourselves and our lives. And as part of that, I've stupidly put it under my laptop, so sorry. I'd really recommend this book, which is the XR Christian book. So I know they're a controversial organisation, but I'd really recommend it, particularly some of the sections on climate grief and repentance are excellent. The second thing I wanted to talk about was kind of specificity. That I think it's important for us, and for me, I've made a real effort to pray through the communities that I was interacting with. I was thinking about the scene in Matthew, I think it is, where Jesus is heals the blind men, and they come to him and he asks them, "What do you want?" Even when it's blindingly obvious, pardon the pun, blindingly obvious. I think there's a real power in specific prayer. And so I would encourage you all to, many churches I know pair with certain villages or with certain communities in other countries. I know my church in Salford is paired with a church in Tanzania. And also, for me, I pray through my list of villages that I went to visit. I think there's a real power in praying specifically for communities and for areas. So I'd really encourage you to do that. If you're still completely at a loss in terms of that, I'd point you to Tier Fund, have some great kind of resources on this in specific countries. And thirdly and finally, the one I'd want to talk about is hospitality. I was challenged in a way I don't think I've ever been challenged when I arrived in the country at the amazingness of hospitality and also God's hospitality for you. This picture here is a picture of the church I was part of while I was in Malawi, called Flood, the Long Way, which was a fantastic place. I was, as a person who was into field work, first time in a country, didn't know anyone, was stuck in this hotel that I didn't know where it really was. I had no idea where it was around me. First, I didn't have a mobile phone. This just became a place of complete sanctuary, and not because of the building, but because of the people. I arrived, and this is my like big God story from my time in Malawi. I arrived at church for the first week I was there. It had been, as I say, a horrible week, but I'd clung to the idea that, do you know what, on Sunday I'm going to make the effort. I'll walk to this church. It took me about an hour to get there, and in the heat and the dust. And I sat down and kind of sat on my hands, looking around, and a lady came up to me. She was sat 2 seats away. I saw her looking over, and I was kind of doing that shifty, well, I'm not new. And she came over and she said, I recognise you. And I said, what? And she said, yes, I had dinner in the hotel you're staying in. I recognise you. Why don't you come and have dinner with my family? And it was incredible. They accepted me in, they brought me in. I ended up staying with them, cooking with them multiple times, babysitting their kids, and they just became a real rock for me. And just God placing me in that exact point next to that person who'd had dinner at the next table to me and I hadn't even noticed was absolutely fantastic. And I think there's a real challenge in that with how we react in our churches to foreigners and also to new people. So I think I just really challenge you all in your prayer life and in your faith life to have your eyes open. And as we kind of head back into churches now, fingers crossed, to be really open to just saying hello to people and introducing yourself and inviting people for lunch, because it was such a game-changing moment for me. I cannot tell you. So yeah, so those are my kind of big reflections on prayer.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Chris. There's plenty to think and reflect on that. I'm not going to suggest we do it in this group session now, but we break into breakout rooms. Could we, Matt, have we got the questions? Yeah. So as you break into breakout rooms, we're a little bit ahead of the ball in time, I think. Yeah, so we'll perhaps give you 20 minutes in breakout rooms. We were going to give you 15, but there's a little bit longer. Obviously, you want to spend a little bit of time introducing yourselves to each other. And obviously, you're grown adults and you can talk about whatever you choose to talk about in that group. But if you're struggling for things to focus your thoughts, a couple of questions that Chris and I came up with beforehand, which I've copied into chat, so you should be able to see there and refer back to. One of the things that I think Chris's experience really brought out is that we tend to think of climate change as something that's going to affect our future, but in Malawi it's a very present reality. And I know that many of us who've got contacts with different parts of the world already know of communities that are already affected. So can you have a chat about what is your experience of different parts of the world and how the climate is being affected already, just to bring home that fact that this is something that is happening at the moment. And a second question, perhaps more related to prayer, is Chris obviously felt really blessed by the welcome he got from those Christians in Malawi. Maybe we could think a little bit for ourselves about how we could make our churches more welcoming to people from different countries and from different cultures. And finally, there will be a little opportunity, 5 or 10 minutes at the end, to have a little bit of feedback and to ask Chris any further questions you've got. So you might want to think about whether there's anything you'd actually like to ask Chris more about that. And when we get back, you can post those into chat. I don't think you can post the chat from the breakout room. Okay, so I'll ask Matt to invite you all to go into rooms, and hopefully he's had time to change the group time to 20 minutes. Okay, so I'll see you in 20 minutes time. Do you think everybody's back? Probably, yeah. Okay, so welcome back to the main room, everybody. So if anybody's got if any questions or comments have arisen in any particular groups, if you could add those to the chat, and we'll see if we can discuss them or have a chat about them. Chris, one issue that came up in the group I was in was a little bit of confusion about whether the biofuels were used for cooking or not. Is that part of the cooking issue, or?
Yeah, they can be. they're quite kind of diverse. So it's a slight, the main issue with cooking is you need some sort of other implement. Like biogas is very easily transferable from sort of, as you think of any sort of camping gas. Using the fuel itself is a little bit more difficult, so it can involve a bit more price, which is what they're trying to do with those bioethanol plants I mentioned. So
the biogas can be put in small canisters for domestic use.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it in Coke bottles and all kinds of things. Yeah.
And just given we've got a couple of extra minutes, going back to one of the questions I glossed over a little bit earlier, which was, I mean, the specific question is the biofuel farming also happening in Zambia? But I suppose the broader question is the picture you're painting of Malawi generally applicable to the whole of Africa, to the whole of Central East Africa, or how does it relate to the surrounding countries?
Yeah, I think there are similarities. I don't know that much about Zambia, apart from me and my wife came over for a couple of weeks and we went on safari in Zambia. That's kind of all I know. Yeah, I think there was a big biogas project in Zambia, but I don't actually know how it went. But yes, there are similar sort of projects, particularly in the more sort of established countries, so the South Africas and the Kenyas. Yeah.
Okay. Partly because it's close to my heart as well as to Tony's, I'll just reiterate the comment he's made at the foot of the chat, is that Christian Aid, as well as Tier Fund and all the aid agencies, are taking climate change incredibly seriously at the moment. I think one of the frustrating things for organisations like Christian Aid is they feel they've been doing so much good for so long and are rapidly seeing it all undone by the effects of climate change in a lot of the countries in which they're working. So if you haven't contributed particularly to Christian Aid last week, maybe you could search out how to do so. It is a big issue for all the aid agencies at the moment. Right, well, we'll say another thank you to you, Chris, for being so receptive to answering our questions. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Andrew for some closing devotions.
You should now be able to see a hymn. Can you? Matt is nodding. Good. Can you hear me? Not very well, I think. Can you hear me all right? Thumb?
Yeah, you're coming through fine, Andrew.
That's good. Okay. We're going to close with some prayer and take into account some of what Christopher has been talking about, and hopefully pray for him and colleagues and the work that they do and the people in Malawi. And then the words of this hymn will conclude those prayers. Well, let us pray together. God, we are partners in this earth in which you have set us. You have called us to be stewards of creation. You created all, and we continue to create, sometimes to meddle at others, to achieve new growth, or to stifle growth which is already present. Help us to better understand this world in which we live, with all its intricacies and complications, with all its difficulties. Help us to work with those of the same faith as ourselves, those of other faiths, and those of none. Help us to act politically that the world might be better nurtured, so that people in places like Malawi may continue to have an existence at all, and that existence might improve as time goes on, rather than be a time of increasing poverty and destitution and death. We recognize that we have a place to play alongside these people and others in our world. How we trust and work together with our partners on this earth will sustain or damn our planet, place of nurture, home of birth. Yet removed and isolated, we have not been stewards of faith. As we pray with understanding, may we channel active grace. May our prayer inspire our actions, not just words or empty rhyme. All our lives are interactive, interwoven threads in time. With a common understanding, sisters, brothers work as one, reap the value of creation as our time on earth is run. Amen. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Andrew. I will circulate the words of that hymn to everybody that registered for tonight's session by email tomorrow morning, I think. Certainly very soon. I'm just going to share my screen. So while Andrew's been writing a hymn, I've been doing something more mundane and entering your postcodes into Google Maps. So if I share my screen, hopefully you will now see a Google map of Britain with the locations that people are coming from. As we might expect, there's certainly a concentration around Manchester. The furthest north is someone from Dunblane in Scotland. Furthest south is someone from Southampton. Furthest east is someone from Ely in Cambridgeshire. And we've got somebody from Swansea as well. So quite a spread over the country. And it's very great to have you all here. We're well short of the limit we've got for these Zoom sessions. So if you know anybody who you think would like to come along to those, please do pass the message on and invite them on my behalf. It'd be great to see them here. And if I could just have the final slide, Matt. I'll stop sharing mine if I can. So I just want to finish off by giving a plug for next week's talk, which is actually going to be next Monday. I'm breaking into my holiday next week, so I'm going to be presenting it, I hope, from the island of Skye. But we've got Tim Gordon, who's a marine biologist from the University of Exeter. He's done a lot of work on the soundscapes of coral reefs, particularly the barrier reef in Australia, and particularly how fish are being affected in that area. He's also written a chapter in a recent book about the grief we feel when we experience the losses that climate change is bringing about. So he's going to talk particularly about lamenting our loss as Christians. And for him, that has two elements. The first one is expressing grief and acknowledging the loss. But the second is channeling that grief and sorrow into working for a better world. So seeing lament as something that has a negative episode, a negative side to it and a positive side to it. So I really do hope you'll join us. Tim's got a wonderful reputation as one of the best young science communicators in the country. So I think it'll be a fantastic talk from Tim. I've just seen something pop up in the chat from Trish. Yes, I hope to get the recording of the whole session tidied up either tonight or tomorrow morning. And when I send out the link with the hymn from Andrews, it will also contain a link through to our website so that you can actually see, you can actually use the recording that we've got from today's session. So that's what's going to happen then. So I want to say a final word of thanks to Chris for making it such a stimulating evening, and I look forward to meeting you next Monday at 7:30 to listen to what Tim's got to say. Thanks very much for joining us.